Welcome to the Cosmic Chosen Channel. Truth doesn't knock for permission. It crashes in, uninvited. And when it does, it doesn't need applause. It just needs one witness brave enough to see it. That witness was you. They said you were paranoid, overreacting, dramatic, that you read too much into things. But while they chuckled in private and raised their glasses in smug silence, you were watching, feeling, discerning. And now? That truth they buried slipped through their own lips, in a drunken ramble, a careless confession, a moment they thought you weren't paying attention. But you caught it. And what they revealed? Unforgivable. Princeton's Sabotage 2014 study revealed that people often reject early truth-tellers because their warnings are too uncomfortable to confront. You weren't wrong. You were early. You weren't unstable. You were awake. And now that everything you saw is unraveling in real time, those same people are suddenly quiet or pretending they never called you crazy at all. The chosen ones are rarely celebrated in real time. Misread, mislabeled, and mishandled, but never misplaced. You were planted in that environment on purpose, not to fit in, but to expose what was hidden. So sip your tea, hold your peace. The story just confirmed what your soul already knew. And they finally revealed the mask, and it's too late to take it back. First of all, you deciphered it. Not simply felt it. You deciphered it, not merely sensed that something wasn't right. You were able to read the deeper cues, such as the tone of their voice, the pauses in their stories, and the change in their energy when the subject shifted, while everyone else was dismissing it and preoccupied with flattering smiles and pleasant conversation. Instead of focusing on their performance, you were listening to what they weren't saying and looking for clues in their habits. Because most people are conditioned to accept what appears to be correct, they miss it. Someone can get away with it if they are sufficiently self-assured, boisterous, and endearing. Not with you, though. Even when everyone is acting as though the pieces of the jigsaw fit together, you've always been the one who can tell when they don't. It's pattern recognition, not paranoia. Even if you can't immediately describe it, you've seen enough, experienced enough, and lost enough to know when something is wrong. As a result, you were able to understand why things would happen rather than merely predicting them. You didn't make a guess. Everyone else believed that the dots you were watching, gathering, and linking were simply background noise. Why was it worse? It wasn't always possible to say it out because, when you did, everyone stared at you as if you were the one causing trouble and causing drama, when, in fact, you were the only one not driving. When you're standing there knowing exactly what's behind the mask, it's annoying to see other people fall for it. Long before the clouds appeared, you could see the storm brewing. The problem is that what formerly seemed like a burden is now your strength. You were supposed to recognize danger before the crowd gathered. You weren't supposed to follow the herd. People are now beginning to make the same connections you did as everything comes to light. However, it's too late. You were just observant. You were never fortunate or psychic. What sets the selected apart from the others is that awareness. Second, you were mocked until your vision and reality aligned. They made fun of you, sometimes in front of you and sometimes behind your back. The sardonic responses, the eye rolls, and the covert jabs veiled in humor. They pretended that you were reaching, exaggerating, and fabricating something when you voiced your truth. However, they also sensed it in their hearts. They were simply not prepared to face it. They chose to target you instead. Making fun of the messenger is easier than dealing with the message. You weren't looking for attention or influence. It wasn't your intention to be a prophet. You just had the guts to say what everyone else was afraid to say. That something wasn't right, that things didn't add up, that there were cracks, real ones, beyond the hoopla and the well-preserved image. However, when you stated it out, it caused discomfort. People laugh when they feel uncomfortable, not because it's amusing, but first because denial is louder than truth. Then the change occurred. Slowly but surely, it became hard to ignore the very facts you pointed out. They began to see what you saw, one by one. The same folks who had been laughing abruptly stopped joking. They were extremely silent, not because they had to apologize to you, but because they were now in the storm you had warned them about. What they don't discuss is how the joke loses its humor when it becomes your reality. You never wanted to be correct, which is the toughest thing. You just refused to remain blind. You weren't looking for anarchy. You opted for knowledge over comfort and honesty over acceptance. And you were the odd one out until you were the first to notice it because of that choice. That's what sets you apart. You gained popularity without waiting for evidence. You followed your instincts, stood by your convictions, and let time speak for itself. Being made fun of is short-lived, but being validated is a lasting impression. Third, you just refused to be blind. You didn't want to be correct. You spoke out because you couldn't ignore what your intuition was telling you, not because you wanted to win an argument. You just couldn't deceive yourself as everyone else was. You weren't wanting to be correct. You had the courage to acknowledge the truth when others were holding on to the narrative they wished to believe. And it's difficult to have that type of clarity. You get isolated as a result. It's genuine, though. People believe that seeing the truth is simple. It isn't. It cost you relationships, comfort, and occasionally even your tranquility. Because there's no turning back once you recognize something for what it is. You are no longer able to pretend. The dishonest behavior, the false loyalties, and the distorted narratives are all too obvious to ignore. It's as if you're destroying the celebration when you attempt to bring it up. You turn into the pessimistic, overly serious, and overly analytical person. In actuality, though, you are simply the one who ceased acting. You simply refused to be blind. You had no desire to be a leader or a hero. Because those who are invested in a lie will stop at nothing to silence the one person who sees the truth. That is what made you dangerous to them. Control is the issue, not disagreement. You also violated the script. The entire act was in danger as you were able to see through the performance. The most absurd aspect is that you weren't even interested in this position. You didn't want to draw attention to anything. The backlash and the friction were the last things you wanted. You just could not remain silent as things worsened. And that's what sets you apart. You were prepared to give up comfort in order to get insight, while everyone else remained mute to preserve the illusion. That is honesty, not ego. You were attempting to avoid lying to yourself, not to be correct. And that alone makes you unique in a society that is based on denial. Fourth, before the fall, you sensed that the atmosphere was deteriorating. You sensed the shift well before the collapse. Not because someone informed you, and not because of some spectacular incident, but because the energy shifted. The excitement that used to seem real started to feel artificial. The smiles became tighter. The praise felt performative. No one wanted to acknowledge that the room was on life support and no longer living. However, you sensed it. Every moment that should have been motivating began to seem empty. No one else wanted to say it out, but something was wrong. You were being truthful, not pessimistic. You were already lamenting the past, while everyone else was occupied with sharing highlights and acting as though everything was going well. You had previously seen the genuineness, authenticity, and passion ebb and go, and you didn't recoil when the inevitable collapse arrived. Long before the public unraveled, you had already gone through the emotional process in private, in silence. How long people can continue to celebrate something that is obviously deteriorating is absurd. They continue to applaud in the hopes that the commotion would mask the cracks because they don't want to acknowledge that they've been following a ghost. However, you witnessed it, you sensed it, and you took a step back and began to let go. Not out of resentment, but out of clarity, instead of waiting for the explosion. The signs were inconvenient, but not concealed, so you knew what was coming. Stop arguing, you learned. When people fell in love with the illusion, you gave up attempting to warn them. While you were already digesting the end, you let them to celebrate the shell. You weren't shocked when it ultimately fell apart either. You were composed because you had already said goodbye, not because you didn't care. You bear the burden of the conclusion before anybody else is prepared to accept it, which is the aspect of early awareness that people seldom fully comprehend. And you're just standing there, already healed, while they're in shock when it finally strikes. Fifth, you realized that your words would be used against you, so you stopped talking. You became silent because you knew too much, not because you had nothing to say. You witnessed how others misrepresented you, cut your truth short, and changed it into something it wasn't intended to be. Whenever you attempted to communicate honestly, it was always reframed as drama, resentment, or ego. Ultimately, you decided to keep quiet, not out of fear, but rather as a tactic. Not because your truth wasn't legitimate, but rather because they weren't prepared for it. You knew it wasn't secure in their hands. What they sought was something to utilize, not clarity. And you understood that they would only hear what suited their story, regardless of how thoroughly you explained yourself. They were listening in order to weaponize, not to comprehend. You then stopped elaborating. You gave up defending what you knew to be true. And that stillness was your method of regaining control, not a sign of weakness. You made the decision to let your deeds, your composure, and ultimately the results speak for you, because there comes a time when standing up for your truth means holding it near and refusing to give it up to those who would only destroy it. When you fell silent, everybody noticed. They believed you were completely depleted. They thought you were done. They were unaware that your quiet was more powerful than any tirade. It was the time you stopped pleading for understanding and began getting ready for the impending storm. And you were prepared for it, so you weren't taken by surprise when it eventually arrived. They will never comprehend that. You were conserving, not concealing. You were preventing the tainting of something precious, because when truth gets into the wrong hands, it turns into gossip. However, when truth is held in the proper heart, it turns into power. And knowing that when the dust settles, silence always wins out over loudness, you've been patiently and silently holding yours. Sixth, their chronology did not include you since you were too young. You were just early, not incorrect. You just landed in a room that wasn't prepared to hear what you had to say. Your timing wasn't off. When individuals aren't prepared, they reject challenges because they're too real, too raw, or too early. Not because they're untrue. You spoke with clarity, and they reacted negatively. Not because you were wrong, but rather because your truth was too strong for them. You gave them a preview of what was to happen, but it was incongruous with the reality they were still clinging to. So they called you overthinking, theatrical, and demanding. It took them some time to come to the same conclusion that you had previously experienced. However, in an attempt to postpone the discomfort, they sought to silence you rather than listen. Just because your clarity came before theirs, you became an issue. Being ahead of the curve is difficult. It's a lonely feeling. Because everyone around you acts as though you're seeing things that aren't there, you start to doubt yourself. Not because you doubt the reality. However, you know in your heart that what you're feeling is genuine. Before the change is apparent, you may sense it. Before it becomes indisputable, you are able to identify the pattern. That's alignment, not guesswork. That's discernment. Vision is that. Many of them heard you the first time, but they weren't prepared to act on it. This is the bit they'll never utter out. They required further consolation, cheers, and time. They attempted to cast doubt on your voice rather than respecting it. However, things that individuals weren't prepared to embrace are always revealed with time. They are now catching up, silently going over what you said again, and privately acknowledging that you were correct. However, you are no longer in need of validation. Since the truth waits and doesn't expire, you've already transcended the need to be believed on their timescale. How about yours? It has been patiently waiting for the other people in the room to catch up to you. Seventh, they called a fire because you were the lighthouse. You were attempting to keep chaos from happening, not to start it. However, they viewed a danger rather than a warning when you got up and pointed out what was approaching. Because your light shone too plainly on everything they didn't want to deal with. The fissures, the faults, the phony togetherness, the unsaid tension. They mistaken it for destruction. You revealed it, not intentionally, but because you had to. However, they referred to you as the issue rather than expressing gratitude. The lighthouse was you. You attempted to steer them away from the storm when you noticed it. However, they were too accustomed to floating and too dedicated to the false sense of security. They frightened when your reality broke through the mists because you can no longer lie once you see clearly. They were afraid of the clarity you carried with you, not of you. They said that your behavior was disruptive, dramatic, and unpleasant. In actuality, nobody else had the guts to express what everyone else was experiencing in silence, except for you. But they viewed you like an enemy because you broke the vow of silence, not understanding that you were the only one attempting to prevent the ship from sinking. Being the first to see the danger is a lonely experience. Even if you didn't generate the tension, you are held responsible for it since you won't ignore it. And people seem startled when the collapse eventually occurs. However, you had already raised the alarm. You were attempting to save it before it was too late, not to destroy it. They see it now. The fire they said you started was already blazing. It wasn't yours. All they wanted was to avoid the smoke. You were the only warning they had, the only one who stood up before the stillness turned to rubble. And when the truth eventually came out, it was obvious that you weren't the threat. Eighth, you saw allegiance turn into power. You saw how loyalty may be used as leverage. Over time, what began as mutual trust and purpose evolved into strategy. People were sticking together because it was advantageous, safe, and profitable, not because they shared a belief in the purpose. Additionally, they formed relationships for convenience rather than progress or awareness when the tides changed. You witnessed it in real time. It was dubbed evolution. However, you saw that it was opportunism. They were faithful when it suited them. When it didn't, they changed their morals and acted as though they were no longer applauding for the same things. You could sense the shift in tone as they began to speak in ambiguous terms and half-truths, maintaining a safe distance in case things were too real. That was positioning, not growth. You could tell the betrayal was coming without any evidence because of the way they abruptly turned neutral when it was necessary to have conviction, the way their energy changed, and the delays in their reactions. You observed how devotion evolved into a performative strategy employed to preserve access or keep up appearances. Alignment with power was now more important than honesty. The most difficult thing was that you couldn't point it out without coming out as resentful or suspicious. Because you knew that time would disclose the truth, you chose to remain silent and observe, not because you were comfortable with it, and it did. People gradually revealed their true objectives, not by staying by you while things were going well, but by leaving you as soon as it became uncomfortable. The revelation that some individuals were only ever loyal to their comfort and never to you is what hurts the most, not the betrayal per se. And they were faithful when that comfort was under jeopardy. They were never truly there in the first place. Therefore, you didn't lose them. You managed to catch them before the mask completely came off. 9. You came to the realization that the community was a costume party. At first glance, it appeared to be unity, a group of individuals working together toward a common goal, helping one another, and creating something tangible. However, the seams became more noticeable the longer you stayed. The assistance seemed practiced. When the spotlight was involved, the accolades came too freely and too swiftly. Everyone had a part to play, and what was being marketed as community was actually a stage and a show. You began to realize that love was a transaction and that individuals were praised for their influence rather than their moral character. The trend was more important than the facts. The most marketable voices were the loudest, not the wisest. Relationships were based on exposure rather than trust. You came to see that visibility was more important than authenticity. You just stopped acting as though you didn't see it. You didn't change. You saw how cooperation was more about clout than it was about connection, and how the tribe only appeared when it was lucrative to do so. And you were gently pushed out, spoken around, or left on red if you didn't play the game, not because you were incorrect, but because you didn't wear the costume. Then it struck you. It was a marketplace masquerading as a community, not one. There was a cost to loyalty. There were conditions attached to praise. And you were rendered invisible the instant you ceased to support the illusion, not because you were no longer valuable, but rather because you no longer matched the pattern. Seeing individuals you previously trusted compromise their authenticity for access was first painful. But suddenly, everything became clear. You weren't for sale, thus you didn't belong. You refused to put up a front. Furthermore, realness will always be too loud in a room full of actors. You took a step back, not resentful, just finished. You could see the plastic through the glitter. What appeared to be a tribe was just solitude with nice clothes. Additionally, you have chosen truth above choreography, even if they continue to dance in unison. Number 10. Without expressing regret, you outgrown their story. For their comfort, they had a version of you that remained little, amiable, and consistent. They gave you a part that suited their story. You were expected to maintain your position, nod appropriately, and never challenge the perception they cultivated about you. But after that, you began to change, quietly at first, as you began to think more deeply, ask different questions, and move in new ways. Furthermore, their plot did not support such expansion. You were just changing. You weren't rebellious. However, your growth seemed like disobedience to them. The dynamics they relied on were put in jeopardy, since they lost control of the story the instant you stopped shrinking. They were unable to confine you to the role that gave them a sense of superiority, wisdom, and control. You didn't seek for permission or provide an explanation, and you outgrown the role they created for you. What truly enraged them was that, so that they could be the leader, the victim, the rescuer, or whatever position they were assigned, they wanted you to continue playing along so that the tale remained clean. However, your reality made everything more difficult. The script was rewritten by your self-respect. And rather than applauding your clarity, people turned away. Not because you changed negatively, but rather because you changed in ways that were too difficult for them to handle. You choose not to express regret for changing. To maintain their comfort, you didn't tone it down. To get acceptance, you didn't retreat back into your old habits or plead for understanding. And your strength was that silent nod. You just stopped bending. There was no need for a huge statement. When you became easier to deal with, you stopped modifying yourself for those who loved you solely. They are now uneasy with your development, not because it is incorrect, but rather because it makes them see where they have remained stuck. However, you're not going to shrink once more to appease them. The old tale is outdated, and you don't regret it. You've just finished living in phases that don't reflect who you've grown into. Number 11. You saw self-interest pass for leadership. It played out in front of you like a well-practiced play. On the surface, it appeared to be leadership, audacious remarks, self-assured actions, and the cheers of an audience that followed each statement. But behind it all, you could see what most people didn't see. It was vanity masquerading as leadership. Every choice, every every statement, every so-called vision was more about promoting the image than it was about directing others. Being seen was more important than serving. You saw how charisma turned into money and how people believed someone had depth the louder they talked. However, upon closer inspection, there was no basis, only rehashed sound effects and skillfully staged performances. They maintained their power by control, rather than by establishing trust or telling the truth. Instead of empowering others, they surrounded themselves with individuals who were unwilling to disagree with them. You witnessed how mentoring devolved into manipulation, devotion was only rewarded without questioning, and dissent was treated with banishment rather than discussion. Those who were helpful were kept near, not because they were valued, and when they weren't, they were discreetly but purposefully dismissed or discarded. What appeared to be an empire was actually a house of mirrors, with each reflection warped to fit a particular story. The worry of speaking too much, asking the incorrect question, or acting inappropriately was palpable in the room. However, you chose to observe rather than participate, and what you witnessed was unavoidable. Realizing how many people did notice it, but chose to remain silent because the illusion was pleasant, and calling it out came with a price was the most difficult aspect. But you weren't made to follow smoke or idolize titles. You understood the distinction between integrity and influence, between presence and performance. And there was no more faking when you realized the reality. There was no need for you to expose them. That's what ego always does on its own. You simply stopped clapping. And that was the loudest truth of all, in a room full of clapping. Number 12. You now understand the distinction between warriors and watchers. The way they nodded, stayed near when it got noisy, and reposted your victories as if they were a part of the narrative gave you the impression that they were with you. However, you recognized the line when things became serious, when the stakes increased, and when the truth ceased to be fashionable. All of a sudden, those pals were standing back, observing, rather than at your side. Silence taught you the difference. Warriors lean in, speak up, and stand up. Watchers do nothing but watch. When it's safe, advantageous, or attractive, they applaud. However, They vanish into the throng as soon as things become awkward, and not because they were blind to what was going on. They did. Simply put, they didn't want to be connected to the aftermath. They didn't want to get too far from authority or risk being perceived as such. Only when it didn't cost them anything did they appreciate your bravery. Only when your truth was encased in something palatable and pleasant did they enjoy it. They stopped. No cover, no support, just silent scrolling, private messages, and public distancing as soon as you stopped performing and began to push back. You became evident at that point. Both those who want a spectacle and those who desire change are out there. The watchers like a good revolt until it calls for their name, until it causes chaos, until it exposes their indolence. When things are tough, warriors don't back down. They take action. They jeopardize their comfort, their name, and their quiet. Observers, they record things for later. After soaking in the moment, they act as though they never happened. Although it was painful, it was beneficial since you now know who is who. Clapping isn't always a sign of commitment. Not all of the people that show up are actually there. You ceased to conflate cooperation with presence. You discovered that not everyone in the audience is cheering you on. Others are only anticipating the collision. However, you are here to develop, not to perform. Additionally, builders require warriors rather than onlookers. Number 13. You knew the foundation, but you didn't foresee the collapse. You didn't make a guess. You didn't want things to go wrong. You just saw the basis, which others didn't care to examine. You were paying attention to the structure, not the superficial hype, but the decisions being made behind the scenes, the motivations, the inconsistencies, and the things that didn't add up if you stopped clapping long enough to think, while most people were preoccupied with the shine, the momentum, and the noise. Momentum and stability are frequently confused. Something is not always solid just because it is moving. You could see how the success was based on unsaid tension, theatrical togetherness, stifled voices, and fragile egos. You saw that the ideals became less genuine the louder the branding became. And you were following the plan, identifying the shortcuts and missing supports, while everyone else was celebrating the picture. You weren't surprised by the collapse because it was never the product of a single incident. Rather, it was the consequence of a pattern, a culture of denial, and a failure to address pressing issues, since doing so would require facing difficult realities. Therefore, they continued to construct faster, higher, and more flamboyant, while feigning ignorance of the groaning beneath. However, you did. You could hear it in every phony grin, every sidestepped query, and every just stay positive tactic used to silence criticism. You were grounded. You weren't negative. Anything based on avoidance eventually costs you money, as you were aware. Additionally, you felt more assured of the fall, not because you desired it, but because you saw it coming in the blueprint. The more they disregarded the warning indications. The construction already included it. People are frantically looking for solutions now that it's falling apart. However, shock is already behind you. They're only now facing the truth that you've been bearing. Furthermore, it's not about being correct. Rather, it's about having the courage to be honest with yourself and being real enough to see what they couldn't. Number 14. You required confirmation, not closure. Closure wasn't what you were after. You weren't waiting by the door for them to return and provide an explanation, an apology, or an apology. The objective was never that. In a quiet, profound manner, you truly want confirmation, not from them, but from time, life, and truth, doing what it usually does, which is to emerge when no one is acting. You were aware of what had occurred. Long before the words were said, you sensed the change, the abrupt distance disguised as space, the performative allegiance, the chilly energy. You were able to see through the polite falsehoods and acts. You didn't argue, though. They never realized that you weren't after being right. You were after being free, which is why you didn't argue your point or bring it to light for approval. When you recognized that closure is frequently a trap, a means of keeping you bound to stories that have already written their conclusion, liberation finally arrived. You gave up attempting to gain answers from those who were occupied with changing history to suit their interests. You took a step back with calm force, not weakness. You were aware that the truth had its own timetable and would ultimately come to light. It wasn't necessary for someone to return with insight. All you needed to know was that you weren't insane, that your feelings were genuine, that your intuition wasn't dramatic, that your inquiries weren't too analytical, and that your boundaries weren't betraying you. You were just ahead of the reveal. You weren't broken. The reality is now quietly and discreetly coming through in the ways that individuals fall apart. You're witnessing everything without having to do anything. Life is revealing itself without any forced dialogue or dramatic revelations. And what's emerging validates all of your earlier doubts. You received confirmation instead of closure, and that was all you ever needed in the end. They referred to you as dramatic, passionate, and excessive, yet you were never excessive. You just woke up in a room full of people who were still comfortably asleep. You were reading the silences, the changes in energy, the truths hidden behind the applause, rather than responding. You were already preparing for the fall since you could see it coming from the way things were constructed, while others waited for impact. The masks are now removed. The delusion is no longer there. The murmurs you once carried alone have turned into echoes in rooms that now comprehend, and what once appeared indestructible has shattered beneath its own weight. You never sought recognition or retribution. The only thing you ever wanted was for truth to enter without your having to pull it. You were early, not resentful. You were straightforward, not polarizing. You outgrown the performance they required you to stay little in, not the people you outgrew out of pride. The true tale here is not the fall, but rather your reluctance to give up in order to maintain the comfort of others in fiction. Therefore, stand tall with serenity rather than haughtiness. So a stage was never necessary. You served as the warning, the evidence, and the signal. The narrative you have experienced now serves as a model for others to follow when they awaken. You were the prediction, not the storm. And you didn't just make it through it. You noticed it, gave it a name, and overcame it. That's legacy, not chance. Don't just scroll on if this message resonated with you, caused you to stop and think, or made you feel seen. In order to reach those who are still in the fog, like the video, leave a comment with your tale, your epiphany, or simply, I agree, if you're now living in truth. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel since this is a place for the called, not the masses. Share this with everyone you know who needs it, whether it's loud or quiet. What matters is that it reaches the intended recipient. This is validation, not just substance. And that's only the beginning. May you be blessed.